Hi and welcome to Thursday of Bridging Week, and today we've got a debate for you, a History Club debate. Now before we go to my two colleagues who are going to be doing the debate, let me tell you a little bit more about History Club. History Club meets once a month. It's a lunchtime thing. It's optional. People can bring their lunch and turn up for as many of these sessions as they like, and it's just a way of opening up other periods of history that we don't study in class. History is more than just the Tudors or more than just, the Nazis or fascist Italy. There's much more of it. And this is a way of doing that. And sometimes the teachers will choose a topic and they're really passionate about, and they'll do a little presentation for you. We get outside speakers in, or we have history debates like this. So it's a fantastic thing on top of what you would do in class. I've taken a few posters at random to give you an idea of what we've done over the last few years. History Club's been going for 14 years now, so this is just a small snippet, but there's one. What have the Romans ever done for us? Okay. Here's another one. We had a professional archaeologist come in and speak to us recently, talking about careers in archaeology and how to do that. We marked World War I, the cultural legacy. That was a top 10 event. We counted down some of the key films and literature and paintings and so on associated with World War I. Here's one about the Younger Dryas, comet impact, Earth crust displacement, and Noah's Ark. That was quite something. This one, pointless quiz we did one time. We try and make it fun. Okay, just like the TV program. Here's another one, Lessons from Auschwitz. This is one we tend to do every year. Every year for the last 10 years or so, we've had 2 to 4 students go to Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland as part of the Lessons from Auschwitz project, and they come back and talk about their experiences. That's something that you might be able to do as well at QE. We have a History Christmas quiz every year with lots and lots of teams. We fill the hall there, the prizes for that. And lastly, here's another one, who built the pyramids. So we visit lots of different periods of history, all kinds of different topics. And as I say, sometimes we do teacher debates, and that's what we're going to be doing today. Now, the good thing about history is there's often not a right answer. History is a subject where you can interpret the past, and people have different opinions on the past. The events don't change, they stay the same, but people have different views about the past, just like politicians interpret what's going on today in different ways. Okay, and it's part and parcel of the course. It's part and parcel of some of the classes that we do. Historians debate a controversy. Indeed, in your second year, you kind of engage with historians' opinions and interpretations in your coursework. In the first year, we do that as well in paper 1. Now, for the Tudor course, that was Elizabeth. The Elizabethan government, was there a crisis in Elizabethan England at the end of Elizabeth's reign? Some historians think there was, some think there wasn't. For the modern course, which is what we're going to focus on in this session, it's about the causes of World War II. And today we're going to debate that, and in particular, Hitler's role in World War II. Some historians think Hitler had a clear plan, a blueprint for war, and that he stuck to that, and he worked it out well in advance. Other historians disagree. They think that Hitler was an opportunist and that basically just exploited the situation through the 1930s and kind of made it up as he went along. So those are the two distinct views that are going to be put forward by my two colleagues today. Now, let me introduce them both, and they're going to tell you a little bit about what they'll be talking about today. So I'll go to James first.
Hi, I'm James. Yeah, I'm going to be hopefully winning this debate, arguing that Hitler was very much an opportunist. In fact, to be honest with you, I might not even give him that much credit. Bit of a spoiler for my argument there.
Thank you, James. And up against James, we have Liam, and he's going to be arguing something different.
Yep. Hi, I'm Liam. So I'm going to be arguing that Hitler did, in fact, have a master plan for war. Not necessarily a particularly good master plan, but still a master plan nonetheless.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, the first thing we need to do is decide who makes their case first. I'm going to give each of the teachers 5 minutes to make their case to try and convince me and you that their point of view, their interpretation is correct. So I have here my special coin. This is actually a coin from 1793. It's got George III on there. Okay, so I'm going to spin this coin. I'll go to Liam. Liam, would you like heads or tails?
Let's go ahead.
Heads. Okay. There we go. I don't know if you can see this, but if I just show you, it's tails. So that's James. Would you like to go first or second?
I'll listen to Liam's first, I think.
Okay.
Liam, you, let's have your 5 minutes. I'm taking notes as well. Let's go.
Right. Okay. So Liam is going to argue that Hitler had a plan, a master plan, a blueprint for war. I'm going to give Liam 5 minutes to make his case. Please listen carefully, and I'll be listening carefully. And I've got a little timer going here, so you can't go over your 5 minutes. So your 5 minutes start now.
Okay, so I think the first thing to preface this with is that obviously there are times when things didn't exactly go according to Hitler's master plan. But I'll just open this up with a quote from the historian Donald Cameron, who says, "Always one returns to Hitler, Hitler exultant, Hitler vehement, Hitler indolent, Hitler playing the great commander, threatening, cajoling, and appealing to German destiny." So I think that gives some idea of very much putting Hitler at the center of a lot of the planning for this. And his sort of conception of this future policy, or his future foreign policy, developed in a couple of stages between sort of 1919 and 1928 before becoming this sort of solid, firm program, which he adhered to fairly single-mindedly until his eventual suicide in 1945. And the thing that you can sort of see in a lot of it is these sort of crude Machiavellian goals, which are almost soaked through on all levels by extremely radical anti-Semitism. So a lot of his foreign policy is sort of influenced in many ways by these theories of a Jewish global conspiracy, which is put forward in things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And quite a few of his aims are based around this sort of central goal of removal of the Jewish archenemy, as well as the removal of sort of other undesirables to clear the way for the German master race and create this German empire in Europe and in the rest of the world. So one of the first places that we can look for evidence of this is in Mein Kampf. Obviously, that's Hitler's book that he wrote while he was in jail after the Munich Putsch. And it's a bit fragmentary and unconnected, but I think there's one sentence in particular in there that can become sort of the crux of his entire foreign policy program, where he states, "Germany will either be a world power or there will be no Germany." So that gives you a sort of quite a clear idea of what he was going to go about setting up with ruling over Germany there. And his aim really was to set them up with control over Europe and also establish a colonial base in Africa and build a strong naval presence to make Germany one of the great remaining world powers, alongside Britain, Japan, and the USA, who he viewed as the biggest threat. And in his eyes, originally, he was aiming for an alliance between Germany and Britain to sort of defeat the USA. And one of the main things that to take note of when looking at this early stage of his plan is that he had this very unrealistic approach in it of England and also of Russia. He viewed Russia with contempt and didn't view them as a particularly big threat. And he also didn't take seriously the idea of England having any sort of response to his aims of taking over sort of other territories in Europe. He didn't think that they would be affected by what he called the clearing up of a regional problem. So the first sort of stage of his goals, which you can see through the rearmament that he goes through in sort of the late 30s, was to bring Germany into a position that there couldn't be any repetition of their defeat in World War I. And essentially the basics of theory was Germany's breakout to the east would sort of defer colonial ambitions overseas in exchange for sort of Britain giving them control over Europe there. And that was what was going to achieve this establishing of a broad base in Central Europe. He concealed this phase through the idea of a struggle against the Treaty of Versailles by sort of exploiting sort of agitation in sort of Austria and sort of other German sort of populated states like the Sudetenland. And this was to be achieved sort of through peaceful means, but when those options were exhausted, they'd be achieved through a series of more local wars using a superior army against one enemy at a time. And he mentions in his sort of secret memo in August 1936 on the 4-year plans that he reckons that peaceful means for German expansion would be exhausted by 1940 at the very latest. So therefore he demanded that in 4 years' time, Germany be ready for action and the German economy capable of waging war, hence the focus on sort of self-sufficiency and on rebuilding up their forces there. And you can see a bit of evidence of this coming through to fruition if we look at a diary entry from one of the German Army General Chief of Staff, Franz Halder, who notes in his diary on August of 29th.
Sorry, that is your 5 minutes up. Okay, so
Can we hear what was in the diary?
Can I finish that quote? Then that'll
you can
be
finish
wrapped up.
that quote. Feel free.
So, August 30th, he notes the arrival of Poles in Berlin. August 31st, collapse of negotiations. September 1st, use of force.
Okay, right. Thank you very much, Liam. So there you go. There's one interpretation that Hitler had this plan for war, and Liam's outlined some of the evidence that he's chosen to use there to support that view. James, you're going to argue the opposite case, that Hitler was opportunist. Again, you've got 5 minutes. Your 5 minutes start now.
Yeah, as I kind of alluded to before, I don't even know if I'm going to give him that much credit, that he was even an opportunist. How I see this is Hitler ended up at the front of a movement that he neither created nor could he control. So I'm going to go further back in time than perhaps Liam, my esteemed colleague's basis of argument. I'm going to go all the way back to evidence like the Pan-Germanic League, to the Navy League, who boasted over 1 million members, kind of way back at the end of the Treaty of Versailles, and suggest that Hitler kind of comes to power on the back of this significantly wider movement for the restoration of German greatness, that kind of thing. And I mean, he himself said that he was the drummer for this movement. But what I'm going to base my argument on is that I think he lost control of that movement. And the evidence for that is far and wide. I accept and I get people who say that Hitler put a great deal of energy and a great deal of planning into coming into power, into getting to power, and even as far as consolidating his position. Okay, I get that. The Rome Purge was fairly sort of, knife's edge stuff. Fair enough. But what we see then is Hitler, once he's in power, he's very lazy in his approach, and I think he loses control in both the domestic sphere and the foreign policy sphere. And the evidence for that in the domestic sphere is this polycratic style of government, whereby he kind of lets other people fight it out. He lets Goering take charge of the economy over Schacht, or even though Schacht would have been a significantly more sensible choice, because he surrounded himself by these yes men. He surrounded himself by these people who were saying, yes, I can deliver this vision, or this supposed vision that you have. We see that as well in foreign policy, because Liam, you mentioned Hitler wanting at one point in time an alliance with Britain, but that kind of is fallen out of favour by 1937 at least, at which point Ribbentrop is our new foreign minister, who is widely described as a psychopath, even by Mussolini. Mussolini called him a psychopath who speaks of war without any idea as to which side to go to war with. And Hitler's perception of Britain changes once Ribbentrop is on the scene. So Hitler loses control of this movement. And to kind of talk about some of the other evidence that you mentioned there, particularly Mein Kampf. I mean, A.J.P. Taylor called that the sort of daydreamings of a failed revolutionary. You know, this was written in 1924, published 1925. But I don't deny the evidence of Mein Kampf, even though reading it is painful, not because of some of the horrible things he says in it, but because of his total lack of organization and writing any lucid thoughts into any kind of organized book. But some of these more influential Nazis never read it. Even Goebbels said if he was in charge, he wouldn't have bothered writing a party program. It was all conceptualized. It was all almost like a phantom vision, this phantom movement. And Julius Streicher, who wrote and edited Der Stürmer, the anti-Semitic newspaper, one of the more circulated Nazi newspapers, said he never read it. He didn't see it, and he actually said, I didn't see a point in reading it. And that's because the movement, this idea of rebuilding Greater Germany, was bigger than Hitler. And in my head, I see him kind of finding himself at the front of this snowball that's rolling down this mountain, and he can no longer stop that. Not that he wishes to, but he has no control over it. And it's other more powerful things behind him that are controlling that. And as for the anti-Semitism thing, I mean, yes, Hitler's horribly anti-Semitic, deeply, deeply anti-Semitic. That exists further back in time as well. I mean, you can go, even in Germany, you can go all the way back the First Crusades, the Rhine Valley massacres, when it was kind of said that any enemy of Christ was an enemy of the Crusaders, and they saw, the Jews and the Muslim empires as being like the same thing, the same kind of enemy. And Hitler just taps into that. And all this other stuff that happens around him, the rearmament, kind of taking these opportunities to rebuild Greater Germany, taking the Sudetenland, taking Austria, whatever, it's window dressing. It's window dressing because he's not stupid. I'm not saying he's stupid. I'm just saying he's not I'm not saying he's not intelligent, but I'm saying he's not in control of this movement. By getting this land in Czechoslovakia, by taking Austria, it's propelling him still to the front of this movement. But it's not him controlling it. He's just sensing the other things that are going on in the European context. Is that my time, Gary?
That is your time. That's 5 minutes up. Now, if I can go straight back to Liam, is there anything you'd picked up on there that you'd like to respond to?
I think when you talked about sort of the bringing in of sort of like, these figures like von Ribbentrop and sort of Goering and like sort of as examples of Hitler sort of bringing it out of sort of losing control, I'd go from the opposite response to that. I'd say that sort of that still puts him at the center of it, because if you look at sort of things like the Rome Purge going on to, or even events following the Hossbach memo in 1937, you see sort of these examples of people who could potentially have threatened him, or people who disagreed with this single-minded approach he had as to what he wanted to happen with Europe in the 40s being removed from their positions and replaced. So I think from sort of my perspective, I'd say that shows him still being at the center of it rather than a lack of control there, I think.
And same opportunity to James. Would you like to come back on anything you've just heard from Liam?
Well, I guess my entire sort of thing was a reply to Liam. The Hossbach memorandum, though, it's kind of funny that we keep coming back to that, and that reminds me about something that you actually said about Mein Kampf, and the quote that you said about Mein Kampf, that Germany would achieve its objectives by force, or there would be no Germany. I read that alongside the Hossbach more of being a fear of Germany's space. There's this obsession again in the Pan-German League and the Navy League that Germany is a nation without space. And in the Hossbach memorandum, Hitler actually speaks about soil erosion and the fact that they're desperate for farmland. They think they can't feed their people. And this explains, again, it's window dressing. This explains why Nazism kind of was obsessed with the heroicness of the soil. Heroes were made in the farms, and socialism was made in the asphalt jungles of the cities. The more logical consistency that we can draw between Mein Kampf and Hossbach there is this lack of living space and this obsession with getting living space. But what I'm suggesting there is that Hitler's not in control of that. I think he considers this to be Germany's greater mission to get this living space. He's just letting other more radical people do it for him. And that's what kind of pushes him into war, not by any kind of master plan. I would call it desperation, not master planning.
Now, can I just jump in here and ask you a question on that? Because wouldn't it be true to say that Hitler was consistent in his aims? You know, we talked about Mein Kampf, that was back in he wrote it in 1924, published in 25. But he always talked about Anschluss. I think that was the very first line. He always talked about a war with Russia in the future. You know, there was lots of evidence of his intention in Mein Kampf. And not only Mein Kampf, that was underlined by other sources of evidence which came later. You know, we could talk about his second book of 1928, the Hossbach Memorandum, which you've mentioned, and I know there are question marks about that, but even rearmament. Hitler was rearming in secret from very early on in the early 1930s and openly from 1935. What about all of that evidence that suggests that Hitler always had war in mind? Perhaps he was flexible with his timetable, but his intentions were clear. War is what he wanted. War is what he desired.
Yeah, I mean, as for this sort of consistency, yeah, I don't want to play the sort of part where I say, no, there's no consistency. Of course there is. But people often overplay this. I mean, there's only 7 pages of Mein Kampf actually dedicated to living space or Anschluss. And yes, you are right. It is the first kind of mention in Mein Kampf. But then he spends a chapter talking about rose gardens and how to prune your roses properly. This isn't the hallmarks of any kind of revolutionary master planning, statesman who's got this other way of doing things. But there is evidence that we have to consider of total lack of consistency. So, for example, in Mein Kampf, to an extent in the second book, he's talking about a possible relationship with Britain. But by Hossbach, he actually refers to them in Hossbach, direct quote, as hate-inspired antagonists. And he calls Britain and France hate-inspired antagonists. By 1938, he's then referring to them as little worms on the back of Chamberlain's triple attempt to make peace with him. But even if we go back to the second book, things have evolved at that stage. And in that second book, this is taken like the William Shirer line, people who see this master plan and take this at face value. He's talking about a possible future war with America. He's talking about taking on Japan, stuff like this. These are the ramblings of a psychopath. We're not talking a concrete plan here. I mean, in this book, which is written sort of between 26 and 28, excerpts came out in 26, he's rattling on about eventually taking on America. It's not because he's got a plan to do it. It's because he's drunk on his own power and on his own success. By this point, he's just absolutely drunk on what he thinks he can do. Also, when you see in lack of consistency is with these kind of series of failed or temporary alliances that he's making. People call this the dynamism of fascism, but it's not. Dynamism's a nice word. It's called blatant opportunism, if you want to go down the flavour of this debate. 1 minute he's making a non-aggression pact with Poland. He's offering to kind of restate that non-aggression pact with Poland as late as 1939, but only if he can get the Polish corridor and the Danzig question settled. This is just frantically trying to kind of snatch these little bits of land back to keep him in power, to keep him in front of this movement, as I say, which he can no longer control. And he was surprised when Britain actually said, right, that's it, we're going to war.
Well, let me put that point to Liam, because is it not true, Liam, that there are lots of examples of opportunism? If you look at Hitler's actions throughout the 1930s, you look at the Rhineland. He did that in 1936. He did that a year earlier than he intended to. He even took the opportunity to march into the demilitarized Rhineland on a Saturday. He thought the British were playing golf. You could look at the Anschluss. The tank commanders there had tourist maps. This was a hastily improvised plan, it would appear. And even the invasion of Poland, which triggered World War II, a week before that, he made a deal with the Soviet Union. Who'd have thought that was ever be possible? So are there lots of examples of Hitler exploiting the situation and taking these opportunities?
I think there's certainly examples of him showing sort of flexibility with the sort of master plan that he sort of has laid out. And I think I'd again come back to sort of the point that I made at the start, where it's definitely not a very good master plan, but it is still a sort of an overall scheme that he has going off there. And I think I'd say James was definitely right earlier on when he brought up the point of Hitler having sort of this sort of fear of Germany, having like being a nation without space, and sort of having that sort of taken away. Because I think a lot of this sort of earlier parts again are him coming in this first phase as a reaction to Versailles, I think, and attempting to undo that in his sort of early stages of the plan. I think this is another quote from Mein Kampf. I think he mentions at one point saying that Britain wants no sort of central European power sort of controlling the whole continent, but France wants no nation named Germany. I think I'm paraphrasing a bit on that because I can't remember the exact quote, but I think there is still sort of very much sort of evidence there of him sort of still sticking to a rough sort of schedule on that. He's going through these peaceful means that he's laid out to try and overtake some of these territories, and then going through with sort of war when that falls through, as he said it would by 1940, which is why he's ordering this massive scale of rearmament.
But you mentioned rough schedule quite a lot. Is that really a master plan? A rough schedule. I mean, my notes for today's debate, that's a rough schedule. That is not a master plan. That is me jotting down in my green pen some stuff that I can think of. And you keep saying like he meant to go to war in 1940 or 43. I mean, this is what kind of Ribbentrop had told Ciano when they were, negotiating with Mussolini for Italian entrance. Well, then they must have stuffed it up, mustn't they? Because they went to war in September. And that's because Ribbentrop's wittering on in Hitler's ear saying, yes, the British are a decadent people. There's no chance they'll go to war. And Hitler listened. He believed him and was like, yeah, okay, Ribbentrop, you've done the legwork. Britain definitely won't get involved. And everything he does, all of these calculations, if you can call it that, this rough draft of a calculation, is based on some spiel this former champagne salesman who's just an absolute zealot has told Hitler. Somebody else is in the driving seat, and Hitler's he's along for the ride, and he had been taken for a ride.
I think
in the driving seat, James. I mean, you mentioned Hitler allowing people to take over. Did he not do this on purpose? He allowed these polycratic things to develop. He allowed different people to do different jobs. He sat back and watched and intervened when it.
But Gary, a door once opened can be used in both directions. He lets these people in semi-purposefully, fine, because he's lazy and he thinks, right, this guy can do a faster job of it than what I can. But then that guy, I always say this, like Hitler's not, obviously he's horrible, but he's not the worst part about the Nazi state. People like Himmler, people like Ribbentrop, they're worse in terms of like how horrific these guys are. And they're whispering in his ear this whole time. You asked me who's in the driving seat. Depends who he lets in at different points in time. But then, yes, he's let them in. Yes, he's opened that door. But then those other people are kind of channeling what they're thinking into him, into his brain. And he's acting on that.
Just let me say this. What about the fact that Hitler seems to have been, obsessed with a number of things, but one of the things that nobody really had any control over him about was foreign policy. He loved to look at maps. He loved to think about architecture, and foreign policy, he seems to have been the determining factor in that. Let's bring Liam in at this point.
Well, I think just sort of in response to what you were saying before, I think definitely sort of right on mentioning sort of the polycratic sort of nature of it, and this whole sort of like almost, it's like a survival of the fittest style government that he brings about a bit. And I think that does definitely make it difficult to get certain elements of a clear path from that, definitely. But I think rather than what you're saying of sort of other people being in the driving seat here, I think it almost becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy with the way he brings these people in. He finds these sort of subordinates who have this similar sort of like-minded approach to him, and they continue to feed this idea that he has in his head of this European conquest and building this world empire. So I think he has this admittedly highly unrealistic master plan, and then you still have the rest of these people coming and feeding him, saying yes, that's good, do that, and sort of pushing that even further. I think is sort of the approach I'd take from that.
And
I mean, there's a
anybody who did
potential.
oppose were dealt with pretty swiftly. I mean, you think about the Hossbach Memorandum, anybody at that meeting who opposed what Hitler wanted to do in terms of his foreign policy plans were removed from their positions. I don't know. I'm doubtful whether people could challenge Hitler on this one.
So what your original question was, Hitler was
Hitler manipulated by other people? Were other people making the decisions and setting the agenda on foreign policy, or was it Hitler's clear plan to go to war at some point in the early 1940s?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of said Hitler's obsessed over looking at architecture, things like that, and one of the few kind of matters of state that he was obsessed with was foreign policy. That doesn't mean he's any good at it. And just because he's obsessed by it, just because he's looking at maps all the time, I mean, it's a famous scene from Downfall, but he's in his bunker trying to move the 12th Army around, right, in the last couple of days, and he doesn't really understand that the 12th Army simply doesn't exist anymore. Just because he's obsessed by this idea of foreign policy doesn't mean he's calculated things properly. Doesn't mean he's not just responding off the cuff to things that are happening around him, such as his kind of growing distaste towards Chamberlain, his growing distaste towards the West. That comes out of their policy of appeasement. So that's him reacting against their policy of appeasement, which grew to convince him that they were weak. Therefore, no consistency or less consistency.
Yeah. If I could just sort of come in, I think that particular sort of Downfall scene that you're referring to, as far as I remember, that's sort of set, 1945, like a couple of weeks before the end of the war. And I think it's definitely fair to say, but by that stage, sort of towards 1945, he definitely lost control. Sort of the war in Europe was coming to an end. The Russians were bearing down on his door. And I think by that stage, yes, definitely he's lost control and Germany's on the verge of losing the war. But I think in the earlier
symptom. That's just a symptom of him having lost control significantly earlier. That's just manifested itself in the sense of a war when he can no longer hide that he's lost control. And that's when all the other guys pushing him forwards lost control. Maybe, yeah. I don't know.
I think obviously again in the later stages he's lost control. Yes, I think what I was going to say is in sort of the start of that period. So when you look at sort of the late 30s, 1939, early 40s. He still has in his head sort of, this master plan that he's determined to follow there. As I've mentioned a couple of times, it's not it's an unrealistic master plan, but a bad master plan is still, an overall plan nonetheless.
What about this idea that external factors, I mean, Hitler obviously is a huge part of why World War II happened, but what about some of the other factors? Did they determine the timing of the war? So, you've mentioned the appeasement policy of, say, Britain and France, the actions of some of the European powers, the fact that the League of Nations was weak. All of these things allowed Hitler the space to become more aggressive. So what about these other factors? Did they determine the timing of war? That question's to Liam.
Right, okay. Makes sense. I think they definitely had an impact. Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I'd say, when you look at sort of this timetable Hitler has laid out for when he wants to go to war and when these things want to happen, why that doesn't quite work out the way he says it will in his approach. Obviously he's got war with the Soviet Union down as starting, it's around sort of 1943, I think, is when he has it laid out for that. And I think in sort of the earlier stages, for example, the likes of in 1939, after the occupation of Prague, Goebbels sort of hints vaguely at long-term aims, but at that stage says use of words like a greater German world empire is undesirable because we haven't really reached that stage yet in his approach. But I think these sort of external events definitely had an impact on changing sort of the timetable that Hitler had in mind for this taking place. I think from his perspective, they were going to happen anyway. I think they just changed when he actually brought that about.
And
So,
James, would you like to
I would,
respond to that?
yeah, I would go almost. Yes, I accept that this is an external issue, but I'm going to bring it back into Germany. It's a perspective that I have a great deal of sympathy for. But the Tim Mason line of argument, in that the economy was a huge factor in this, and if we look at the chain of events up to the invasion of Poland, and if for now we just accept the argument is my argument that I'm going to put forward is built on the premise that he was surprised in 1939. I realise that's a matter of contention, and some historians suggest that he actually, he just wanted war in 39, and he was provoking the Allies, and he was expecting them to say no, that's enough. But if we accept for the time being that that was an accident, that that was a mistake, then logically he might not have wanted war at all. He might just have been trying to shore up his own economy, because this is the Tim Mason line, but he worried incessantly about his own popularity. He worried incessantly about whether or not the working class might rise up against him in his own country. And these constant kind of foreign policy successes without combat or without significant combat keep him in power, and it keeps him popular as he rides this wave of this movement that he didn't create and he didn't control. By taking this land from Czechoslovakia, he gets the Skoda Arms Works, he gets a couple of, 1,000 square kilometers of potential farmland, he gets some German speakers back. Okay, he's popular again. People keep quiet. They think, right, okay, fine, this is working. This movement that kind of all of Germany's willing Hitler to be in the front of keeps going. Same with Austria. He gets masses of gold reserves with Austria. He tries it again with Poland. This is plunder. This is theft. This is stealing of resources. And it was his last chance. It was his absolute last chance. This is Karl Dietrich Bracke here. It was his last chance where he could justify taking land by saying, I'm just reversing the Treaty of Versailles. I don't think, if we accept that that was a mistake in 39, he might not have wanted war at all. And if he'd gotten away with that, we're playing a game now, I know this is speculative history, and I can see your face turn upside down already, Gary. I know you don't like this. But if we accept that as logical, and if we assume that Britain and France, in some kind of alternate reality somewhere, didn't go to war, might Hitler have stopped, reevaluated, and thought, right, hold on, they've caught up with us. Britain now has the same kind of armaments we do. How much further can we push this? Where else would he have gone?
And yet, in March 1939, Hitler marched into Prague and became an imperialist. He certainly wasn't uniting Germans then. And arguably, he was moving ever eastwards, and claiming his living space. And even though there was the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939, I don't think Stalin trusted Hitler. I think Stalin was playing for time. And I think everybody...
But then might we have just seen...
battle would take place, as it did, on Russian soil.
But then might we have just seen...
Sorry, go on.
A war, then might we have just seen a war between Germany and Soviet Russia, with the other major powers simply not involved or relegated to the rank of spectator? Was that his master plan?
Well, I think that's what he wanted, because he wanted an alliance with Britain, as you rightly said earlier on, up until 1937. He never wanted a war on two fronts. In many respects, he learned the lessons of World War I.
Sorry, Gary, I'm going to have to come in there, because in the Hossbach memorandum, he actually did say, and this is why he replaced von Blomberg and von Fritsch in 1937. It's because he actually, one of his possible three plans that he discussed in the Hossbach memorandum was a war on two fronts. So he did toy with the idea of a war on two fronts, but I think that's more a symptom of, by this point, he's drunk on his own power. And I think he's drunk on his own power because he's riding this populist wave at this point in time. I don't think he's in control of that wave.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely find sort of references sort of at an earlier sort of point as to why he's sort of fixated on this idea of invasion of Russia, and perhaps why he does it when he does. And he has this, as I mentioned earlier, that his policies, super permeated by all this anti-Semitism on all levels, and he views sort of Russia as a sort of a key element of this, and has this fear that this Bolshevik revolution, over which in his eyes the Jews had gained dominance, would sort of radiate out into Europe if it wasn't stopped, which is why he has this focus on taking over all the space there and sort of eradicating the population there. Just going back to what you mentioned before about the his fears with the economy as well. I think that's where this sort of idea of like blitzkrieg comes in, this like, lightning war, and sort of taking over these resources. And I think you can link that back further to this reaction to Versailles into World War One as well. Obviously, you mentioned that one of the reasons Germany lost in World War One because of the sort of waging of war on two fronts. And I think part of the reason why he's so focused on rearmament on autarky is to prevent a possible repeat of that, which is why he wants to have this self-sufficient large empire that can withstand blockade and can withstand war on several fronts.
Okay, now I am conscious of time passing, so I'm going to give you now, I think, about a minute just to sum up and convince me that I should vote for you when it comes to deciding who wins the debate. So I'm going to toss my coin again to do this. See who goes first. Let's just say heads, it's James. Tails, it's Liam. Tails, it's Liam. So if you'd like to go first, you've got a minute, Liam, to sum up your key arguments.
Okay, so I think key arguments for this, I think, would be sort of taking evidence of this reaction to World War One, as I mentioned, these sort of anti-Semitic ideas and this idea of slowly expanding out of Germany's territories one step at a time and eventually overtaking the rest of Europe and establishing a base in Africa as well. Obviously, this overarching plan, as I said, based on unrealistic conceptions of other countries such as Russia and of Britain, and the timetable that he has for this changes as this goes on because of external events. But I think there is definitely a clear pattern of events that do show elements or evidence of Hitler being at the center of this and having a definite, sort of overarching plan for war in 1939. That's it from me.
Yep, thank you very much. So, James, you've got a minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Hitler was just riding this populist wave, and I think everything he did was frantic attempts to keep himself and the Third Reich in power, and to kind of not restate but double down on my basis of evidence there as to the fact that Hitler found himself in front of this snowball, to use my metaphor, or riding the top of this populist wave, is that there's more sort of influential things, undercurrents beneath him. Is it, even if we go right back to when Hitler was kind of put in charge of the German Workers' Party by Anton Drexler, it's because he could whip up a storm, because he could make a speech. And if you're making speeches to a crowd, you're a raving lunatic unless you have a receptive audience. And ideas do not exist in a vacuum. And Hitler was the statement of an idea that was significantly bigger than him. And I think all of these voices that he surrounded himself with throughout the duration of this time were just restating this idea, and the timetable was dictated more so by them and more so by the economy and their perception of the wider world, such as Ribbentrop's wider perception of Britain.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's it. I've heard all the evidence. Very difficult this to
No, it's not.
It is very difficult. It is very difficult because in some ways for some points you were agreeing with each other, I think, and clearly he did have some aims that were fairly consistent. That's true, and the timetable did change in some respects. He was an opportunist, and there are some historians that take elements of both your points of view and kind of amalgamate them together. I'm thinking of Ian Kershaw, a fixed plan but a flexible timetable, and there's something in what Liam was saying there. Very difficult. I think it's very hard to do this. On balance, I'm probably going to go with James, I think. I'm sorry, Liam. I'm going to go more of the opportunist. You convinced me slightly more. Although I have to say, I was tempted to go for a draw
You
But-
fence sitter, Gary.
not on one side or the other. But you both argued extremely well, and it was a very, very difficult decision, that. And of course, there is no right answer. So you get the chance to take part in these debates. We have class debates where you too could be on one side of the class or another, making points like Liam and James have just made. We often do this with a student jury who decide who are the winners. The beauty of history is there isn't a right answer. It's how you argue, how you use your evidence, and how you form your own opinions of the past. I'd just like to finish by thanking our two participants today, James and Liam. Well done, you
Hats
both.
off, like Liam. You made that very hard. I was sweating a little bit at times, and even I might have gone for a concession. I was sweating a bit.
Very, very good. Yeah. Thanks again to the pair of you. That's it for the debate, but tomorrow, please look out for our live webinar session. That'll be at 3 o'clock, live Zoom webinar, and it'll be your chance to ask us some. We'll be announcing the winners of the various competitions that have taken place this week, the time capsule and the grand history quiz, and we'll be giving the answers to that quiz as well. So please do try and make that if you can. That's 3 o'clock on Friday. But that's it for now. Thanks again. Thanks for watching, and thanks to Liam and James. Thanks and bye.